Good morning. Welcome to the round one of the 2021 Regions Cup competition. Is everyone ready to go? Judge Shibley? Awesome. Yes. This is an opportunity to engage in an Oxford-style debate on a topic related to free speech. The prompt the students will discuss today is, there are legitimate reasons to ban political clubs on campus if they support political candidates that use inciting speech. I'm going to explain to you the phases of the debate, then I'm going to introduce our judges. There are 3 rounds to this style of debate. In the first round, you'll hear opening statements presented by one student from each team, the affirmative team and the negative team. In the second round, the teams will engage in cross-examinations. This is an opportunity for the students to answer questions from the moderator. In the final round, one member of each team will present closing statements. At the conclusion of this debate, our judges who have received training on how to score Oxford debate will complete their scores of the event. We will post the results of this round following the second round of the debates this morning, and you will be able to find these on the Regions Cup's website. I'd like to introduce our judges. We have Honorable Clint Bullock, an Associate Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court. We have Gretchen Conger, Deputy Chief of Staff from the Governor of Arizona. And we have Robert Shibley, the Executive Director for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Thank you so much for all of our judges. Judges, remember, you should be objective and unbiased as you listen and score the round today. Your score should reflect who made the better argument. Students, before we begin, please note I will give you a 1-minute hand signal when each round is about to wrap up, and I will announce the end of the round. All right, I would like the affirmative team to begin first, and we will begin with opening statements.
Perfect. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me pretty well. Cool. So, is everyone ready?
Yes, please.
Jake and I affirm the resolution. Resolved, there are legitimate reasons to ban political clubs if they support political candidates that use inciting speech. Before we begin, allow us to provide the following definitions of key terms in today's topic. First, a political candidate is any person that is being considered for some kind of position, whether to be elected or selected to an office. Second, the U.S. Federal Election Commission identifies the following actions as ways to support political candidates: making financial contributions to a specific candidate or political party, utilizing public communications to express support, host home events, or engage in personal services. Now, let's take you back to 2015. In an undercover investigation, 2 students from Barry University and Cornell University went to their respective college advisors, pitching their fictional club dubbed Sympathetic Students in support of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They pitched it as a campus club that would send money, which notably is a form of political support, and care packages to ISIS members and their families. Surprisingly, the recordings of their conversations indicate that the college faculty were open to the establishment of these clubs in support of ISIS. Thankfully, these students were not genuine in their proposal. They were merely trying to gauge their institution's reactions, but they demonstrate the plausibility of harmful and violent political clubs being formed that are anti-free speech, anti-American, and anti-democracy. Although ISIS has declined in power recently, according to CIA intelligence assessments in 2014, over 2,000 fighters were recruited to militant militias from Western countries. That's 2,000 young men and women brainwashed into joining extremist forces by vile political operators of the Islamic State. ISIS used inciting propaganda to convince young people to support and join their cause. Now, the negative team is likely to argue that it's difficult to establish a bright line for inciting violence, but we strongly believe that ISIS has made its intent to attack America clear. Former ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi warned, quote, "Our last message is to the Americans. Soon we will be in direct confrontation, and the sons of Islam have prepared for such a day. So watch, for we are with you, watching," end quote. Following the beheading of American journalist Steven Sotloff, an ISIS representative declared to former President Obama in a video that, quote, "Our knife will continue to strike the necks of your people," end quote. After the beheading of James Foley, another U.S. journalist, the ISIS executioner says directly into the camera, quote, you are no longer fighting an insurgency. We are an Islamic army. We'll drown all of you in blood," end quote. These uses of inciting speech have devastating consequences. The nightclub shooter in Orlando frequently viewed ISIS propaganda and violent videos like these distributed by ISIS, which investigators contend were critical in his indoctrination and incitement to action. He killed 49 people. The San Bernardino shooters pledged their allegiance to ISIS in an online post before carrying out their attack. They killed 14. The sympathetic students in support of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was not a proposal for a religious club, which would obviously be an acceptable student organization, but rather a proposal for a very dangerous political one. As the affirmative team, we recognize the history and the assumptions that underlie this resolution. Jake and I wholeheartedly oppose any form of discrimination against conservative or liberal students in order to advance a certain political agenda on campus, an example of which can be seen with the recent pushes to ban right-wing organizations like Turning Point USA on college campuses simply because of ideological disagreements. College should be a place where ideas are challenged, debated, and discussed, not banned from public view. We agree that this is detrimental to the marketplace of ideas and unjustifiably places blame on students for the statements made by political candidates they support. It is not our position that bans such as these are appropriate or just. We are not arguing that any and all bans of political clubs that support candidates that use inciting speech are legitimate. Rather, this resolution and the topic of this debate is a referendum on whether there is at least one instance in which there are legitimate reasons to ban a political club on campus for the usage of inciting speech. Critically, this means that our opponents need to prove that there are never any legitimate reasons to ban political clubs on campus that support certain candidates that use inciting speech. Our position is that it would be legitimate and just to ban a political club designed in the same vein as the ISIS example above to support violent acts through financial or other means. We cannot let violent extremists gain legitimacy in educational spaces. Supporting terror is not free speech. That is a malevolent act. Of course, we all agree that ISIS's acts of terror are reprehensible. But more specific to today's resolution, we are arguing that organizations like ISIS are comprised of candidates that use inciting speech, making them fair ground for this discussion. ISIS in the past and even today operates as a political governing body. Their multi-level governing body consists of dozens of political leaders, including governors, council members, cabinet members of senior leaders, and more. Each political candidate affiliated with ISIS relied on donations and support that fall under the U.S. Federal Election Commission definition that we had provided earlier. As the affirmative team, we have argued that ISIS's history of propaganda disseminated through social media is reason enough to ban a political club on campus that supported political candidates associated with their organization. Organizations like ISIS do not exist in isolation of their rhetoric, and political financial support of ISIS does not exist in isolation of the violence and discord ISIS causes. To limit university violations of free speech, we propose the Brandenburg test to determine whether political clubs should be banned on campus for supporting candidates who speak or use inciting speech. As the Cornell Law School's Legal Information Institute explains, quote, the Brandenburg test was established in Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969 to determine when inflammatory speech intending to advocate a legal action can be restricted. The test determined that the government may prohibit speech advocating the use of force or crime if the speech satisfies both elements of the two-part test. First, the speech is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and second, the speech is likely to incite or produce such action. Supporting violent extremism against the United States in the form of monetary support for ISIS is clearly directed to produce lawless action. While the ISIS example never came to fruition, we cannot leave universities unequipped to stamp out violent extremism and terror sympathy on their campuses. Take our argument here today as if we were proposing a thought experiment to test the validity of the question posed by the resolution. We employ the example of a pro-ISIS-like club for the sole reason of grounding our thought experiment in a real-world instance to some degree. We think that foreclosing the ability of colleges to ban organizations like the ones we've mentioned can lead to real material violence on and off campus. So long as we can prove a single example in which banning a political club is valid, we urge that you vote affirmative in today's round. Thank you.
Right, and will then the negative side begin, please?
Just to make sure, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
We want to begin by thanking the judges and opponents for allowing us to speak on such an important matter. Marnie and I negate the resolution. There are legitimate reasons to ban political clubs on campus if they support political candidates that use inciting speech. To clarify, we offer the following definitions. Inciting speech is defined as encouraging unlawful behavior. Support is defined as to give approval or to be in favor of, and legitimate is defined by conforming to the law or rules. We want to make it very clear that not all inciting speech is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court case Hess versus Indiana, the court applied previous precedent and stated that before an individual's speech could fall under the unprotected category of incitement to imminent lawless action, the speech must lead to imminent disorder. However, inciting speech that does not pass the Brandenburg test of imminent lawless action is still protected under the First Amendment. We want to stress to the judges that simply supporting candidates that use inciting language does not mean that they themselves are at fault for such speech. Support does not equate to promote, which would be encouraging, urging, or inciting. For example, the Young Republicans support Republican candidates, whether it be presidents, senators, representatives, what have you. However, that does not inherently mean they agree with all of the beliefs that every candidate stands for. In an interview in 2020, Bernie Sanders said he supported Joe Biden. However, he explained Joe's agenda is not my agenda. Our opponents present the extremist option, generalizing either party down to one political candidate. However, affiliated clubs who support these candidates are not inherently responsible for their speech. If the club is not the one presenting the speech that is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and if it is likely to incite or produce such action, then stripping them of their right to support a political candidate goes against the First Amendment. Additionally, the Equal Access Act makes it illegal for any school that has at least one non-curricular club to discriminate on the basis of religious, political, philosophical, or other content of the speech at such meetings. This rule applies as long as the club is voluntary, student-initiated, and doesn't interfere with the orderly conduct of the educational activities. The Board of Education of Westside Community Schools versus Emergence upheld the constitutionality of the Equal Access Act. Although the Equal Access Act is for secondary education and not colleges or universities, they're still required to grant students' organizations the same rights of access decided under Windmar versus Vincent and Rosenberg v. Rector and Visitors of the University of Virginia. These both claimed that the campus of a public university, at least for its students, possesses many of the characteristics of a public forum. All of us are considering this resolution. We understand the concern that permitting non-curricular clubs and creating this limited open forum would enable all clubs to remain on campus despite any language that they personally use. However, this is not true. The Equal Access Act does not restrict schools to prohibit vulgar, lewd, or obscene language as ruled in Bethel v. Frazier. This enables them to maintain order and discipline on school premises and protect the well-being of the students and faculty. The Supreme Court case Tinker v. Des Moines also dictates that schools can prohibit speech that intrudes upon the rights of other students. There's also a safe harbor provision negating the purpose of protection and extremist groups with the key focus to maintain order and discipline. This all relates to the fact that schools already have in place protection both for students and affiliate clubs, but also clear guidelines for what is protected and what is not. If it is the club that begins to incite violence and disruption, then they're already going to be banned from campus. Based on the legitimacy argument, there are no legitimate reasons for a school to ban political clubs based on inciting sentiments made by specific political candidates. Legitimately, a school cannot refuse access to a group unless said group has caused disruption or violence. Access may not be denied based on support of a candidate because this does not inherently threaten campus safety. As inciting speech with no imminent lawless action is covered by the First Amendment, simply showing support for a controversial candidate is not a legitimate claim for attention. The disruption that may be caused by resisting these groups are also not a legitimate claim for punishment. We want to emphasize that students who disagree with a club on campus should be encouraged to create counter clubs voicing their differing opinions rather than banning others with affiliations they don't support. While our opponents may try and argue these disagreements would cause disruption, we contend that we are encouraging a robust exchange of diverse ideas and viewpoints. As Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously stated in the Whitney versus California decision, if there be time to expose through discussion the falsehoods and fallacies to avert the evil by the process of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. We are arguing for the status quo, meaning that universities must follow the direction of the First Amendment and previous court ruling. Arguing against the status quo is claiming that implementing campus legislation restricting forms of free speech is more important than maintaining public rights granted by the First Amendment. The status quo implements punishment only if said inciting speech is done by the political club and such behavior results in a disruption on campus. Therefore, the AF's argument is unnecessarily restrictive of free speech. Partisan clubs are given essentially the same right as an individual regarding politics, meaning that restricting groups could lead to restricting individuals. Joining a university should not equate waiving your First Amendment rights, which is exactly what the affirmative is supporting. Voting negative is voting for free speech on campus. Thank you.
All right. For the affirmative speech, how would you respond to the concept that the remedy is the remedy should be more speech versus banning the political clubs?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this in context to the example that the affirmative gives of pro-ISIS organizations. I think it's important to recognize that counter organizations and imagining what that looks like would likely create more and more violence. You're putting other students at risk to creating a counter organization to rebuke and to refute the claims of pro-ISIS organizations is not going to create anything beneficial for either groups. We think that it's only going to lead to more violence and more harms within the college campus.
And to the negative, sorry? To the negative group, how would you respond to that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Marnie.
Yeah, absolutely. We understand where you're coming from, but Zane, you yourself already said that this club did not come to pass, so you have yet to give us an example of an actual political club on campus who has used supported candidates using inciting words. Also, the example you did use, you said the administrators were the ones who wanted to push this forward. However, it is not the administrators who get to fully decide on this, as they're already biased toward one affiliation or another. That's why we brought up the Supreme Court cases that we did, because that's the ruling that should be set for it.
But then how would you distinguish the Supreme Court cases that focus on secondary education versus post-secondary education to the negative group?
As I mentioned in my opener, a lot of the post-secondary schoolings have been held to the same standards as like high schools and elementary public schools, because they are publicly funded. They're held to the same regard in the same court cases.
And how would you respond to that on the affirmative side?
I think specifically one thing they bring up under the Equal Access Act, which is that secondary education law criterion no longer protecting a club, is when these clubs or organizations disrupt the orderly conduct of schools. And we take you back to the example we brought up in the affirmative, where there's examples of a club that was attempting to support violent extremism. We would argue that supporting violent extremism and supporting violent acts of terror against the United States would directly disrupt the orderly conduct of schools in the United States.
How would you respond to the idea that violent extremism is different than political candidates?
Yeah, certainly. I think really looking toward our definition of what a political candidate is, and then looking at how ISIS has been structured in the past and continue today. We'd show you in our first case that individuals in ISIS are comprised with a governing body where they have political leaders, they have council members, they have people for their superintendent leadership, they have different organizations that resemble a political group, and they accept political donations that further support their political cause. We think that they have established themselves as a political party, and they have continued to remain as such as a governing body. So we think that there's not a distinction between the two, which is why we think that ISIS is a good example of a political organization that goes beyond just simple partisan politics here in America.
And the negative team, how would you respond to that?
Again, I would like to state that they are heavily relying on one example that already did not come to fruition. So I would ask you guys to give us any example of a political club where this has happened.
And can you give that such an example to the affirmative side?
I mean, first, I would say that when we look towards the resolution doesn't state that there has to be tons of examples or tons of clubs that we want to ban from campus. But is there any legitimate reason in existence to ban political clubs on campus if they support political candidates that use inciting speech? So therefore, in our case today, if we can prove to you even one possible instance that was pursued on 2 different university campuses in America, where we believe and you believe that there is a legitimate reason to ban the political club on campus, then you would still vote affirmative. Basically, the negative is trying to say that this has never happened. But what we're saying is if you negate today's resolution, you no longer allow universities recourse in these very, very extreme examples. We agree with the negative that in most cases, we shouldn't be banning clubs that are supporting controversial candidates. But what we should be doing is banning clubs that provide monetary donations to political organizations that are trying to accomplish violent acts.
Is there a difference between an organization and a candidate to the affirmative side?
So we think that ISIS has had candidates in the past. There have been multiple political candidates in ISIS, not here in America, but elsewhere abroad. And those individuals accept donations and they have positions that they're being selected for or running for, and they have other political candidates that they're going against in those areas. So we still think that there are political candidates within that organization.
And how would you respond to that, to the negative side?
Yeah, I would like to point out that Zane did say that we think ISIS has had candidates and we think that it's different. So again, they're fully running on this ISIS campaign. However, they still haven't brought up a different example, and they said, we think that they have candidates.
And
Yeah, I apologize if I had said I think. We know that there are candidates in ISIS that comprise their governing bodies. There are multiple examples. They have leaders, they have sub-leaders underneath that. I apologize for the misspeaking on that, but we know with certainty that there are political candidates a part of ISIS that continue to perpetuate its effectiveness and survival and continuation of a large organization of terrorism.
And to the negative team, you had mentioned that there were rules to address the concerns about inciting violence on campus. Can you explain?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, what university campuses and school campuses are in charge of is they have an interest in keeping their students and faculty safe on campus. So if they're, they can control things of if they believe legitimately that there may be violence on campus because of inciting words said by students or potentially a speaker that may be invited. They are very much allowed to have time and place restrictions in order to make sure that they have as much utmost safety on campus as they can. But I think our opponents are trying to draw heavily on the idea that inciting violence in another place, somehow universities have the ability to control violence as kind of a broad spectrum rather than just violence that may legitimately happen on their own campuses.
On the affirmative side, how would you respond?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and this is what the debate's probably going to evolve around. We think that by donating and giving financial support to ISIS, there is no way that you can isolate that donation from the actual acts of violence that ISIS is committing. The negative team has said in their previous speech that we can't combine all aspects of an organization and say this one candidate supports everything, or that our support is somehow representative of the entire organization. But we think when it comes to cases like terrorist organizations as ISIS, the support for that organization cannot be separated from the acts of violence and the use of inciting speech that organization consistently uses.
You had indicated on the affirmative team that the Brandenburg test would permanently ban any, would be used to support banning in organizations like ISIS. Would that permanently ban anybody who supported ISIS?
It would only be in instances where they are giving like direct financial support or support to these political candidates. Because when we look at the two conditions of the Brandenburg test, we first see that there's speech directed to incite or produce imminent lawless action. You can go back to the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi quotes that we provided for you, and that the speech is likely to incite or produce such action. You can look to the examples we provide you of the nightclub shooting in Orlando. You can look to the examples of the San Bernardino shooters. You can look towards the 2016 Ohio State University attack, where Abdul Razak Ali Artan pledged his allegiance to ISIS and attacked the campus with his vehicle. So we do believe that any instance of physical support or monetary support to an organization like ISIS that engages in these violent acts would lead to a permanent ban from campus. However, clubs and organizations are definitely free not to support ISIS, not support an extreme violent group that is trying to attack the United States.
How would you respond to that, the negative team?
I think our opponents are relying heavily on the idea of inciting words and actual violence happening. We want to distinguish that those are two very, very different accounts. And if we start to conflate the two ideas, if we suggest that anyone who may speak words that might incite physical violence ever. This historically could be used to argue that civil rights speakers such as Malcolm X, who incited and riled crowds who may eventually have committed violent acts, people who are influential to the history of freedom, would potentially, under the guise of the affirmative resolution, be banned from campus for having civil rights political groups who support someone like that also be banned. It's much too broad of a spectrum.
How would you respond, Zane?
Right. I think that's an important distinction to be made, and it's an important concern, but we think that we have made that difference in the delineation between inciting speech and acts of violence. We give you multiple examples of inciting speech from political candidates within ISIS, be it Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, or the former representative of ISIS declaring to President Obama saying that, quote, "Our knife will continue to strike the necks of your people." We give you multiple quotes and examples of inciting speech that are directed to incite violence amongst a specific person that is imminent, and it's clear that it's imminent because we've had multiple attacks that we've identified.
Can I also contribute, or is that?
Yes, Jake, you
Okay.
can contribute.
So I think it's also important to look back to the Brandenburg case, and the Supreme Court specifically outlines that strong and effective extemporaneous rhetoric cannot be nicely channeled in pure dulcet phrases. An advocate must be free to stimulate his audience with spontaneous and emotional appeals for unity and action in a common cause. So most examples of these violations of the Brandenburg test are actually like not successful because the Brandenburg test is really, really, really narrow. You can't just say like, we're going to the street and like, we're going to like take back our city or take back our legislator. Like that's not specific enough in order for the Brandenburg test to be violated. But in instances where the people you're supporting and the speech is specifically talking about violent acts against the United States, which is then followed up by individuals who followed that call to action and committed violent acts against the United States, that does apply in the case of the Brandenburg test.
How would you respond to that on the affirmative side?
Yeah, if I could just redirect quickly for the judges, it seems like we are getting a little ahead of ourselves strictly on the ISIS case. We are trying to redirect back to a school campus and the clubs affiliated with said school that are promoting these candidates. So we want to make a clear distinction between just simple support and what our opponents have been saying. What they are saying is any endorsement is saying, I support all these ideals, all of this, again, with the extremist view of ISIS that we want to kind of redirect back to what is happening currently, not in a hypothetical that they're bringing up. So using their argument, I could tell you, if you have ever had Chick-fil-A, you are in turn giving that company money, and they inherently support non-LGBTQ plus issues. So just because you guys would be endorsing Chick-fil-A, does that mean you also believe in these issues? And that is the distinction we are trying to make.
To the affirmative side, you have to the negative side, the affirmative side has said that you have to show that there's never a reason to ban political clubs on campus. How would you respond to that?
So I think they're using a very narrow scope to look at the resolution. They said that we have to prove that there's never, ever a reason to ban political clubs on campus. However, if you look at the entire resolution, it's specifically banning them because of their support of political candidates that happen to use inciting speech. So if the reason is someone uses inciting speech and a club has previously supported them in any way, whether it be a follow on social media, whether it be monetary donations, we're drawing the distinction that there's not a reason for universities to ban clubs simply because of the association with a political candidate that they might disagree with the statements of.
Would you respond to that on the affirmative side?
Okay,
Right.
so
You can go ahead, Jake. You're good.
all right. So I think that most of the examples that the negative has brought up, like the Young Republicans Club, at no point do we argue that they ever supported a candidate using inciting speech. The Chick-fil-A example, while they may donate to organizations that oppose, gay marriage rights, Chick-fil-A at no point came out and said that they're going to like kill every homosexual that they see in society, right? Like there is a very big difference between inciting speech and speech by controversial candidates. And so what we're saying is that in these very hyper-specific instances where these political candidates or political groups specifically outline and call for violent action against United States citizens, those are the only instances in which there are legitimate reasons to ban political clubs on campus. But if there is any reason, any legitimate reason at all, this resolution must be affirmed. We're not saying that every single instance in the past where universities have possibly attempted to ban a political club from campus was just or was legitimate. We are simply arguing that there are some legitimate reasons to ban political clubs on campus, especially if they support political candidates that use inciting speech directly calling for violence.
To the affirmative side, how would you distinguish that between a political candidate or from one of our parties that calls for protesters to riot in response to a court verdict? The affirmative side.
Yeah, so we think that there's not a there's a large difference between the actions that ISIS is doing. We don't think it's been proved in any court cases that any existing actions or speeches made by political candidates thus far have used inciting speech. We don't think that the negative has yet proved that, and we don't think that courts have ruled that either. We think that it is possible for a political candidate to act similarly to the ways in which ISIS political candidates have acted, but they've not yet done so, and that's not what the affirmative is focusing on.
And I would just like to add that both in the case of Maxine Waters, which I'm assuming is the event that you're referring to, and also in the instance that many Democrats said that Donald Trump was using inciting speech on January 6th, we don't think that either of those instances would actually pass the very strict and stringent standards established by the Brandenburg test, because again, we mentioned that in the Supreme Court case specifically respects rhetoric, among other things, if it is not specific calls for acts of violence against specific people. The difference is that ISIS has specifically called for the death, bombing, and killing of United States citizens explicitly, and then people took that explicit message and followed through with it.
And to the negative team, how would you respond to that?
Again, I think we are stuck on this ISIS standpoint. The app had already mentioned the examples that we have brought up. And then they just keep explaining that they've brought up hyper-specific instances, but this is only just instance that already did not come to fruition. I think we have to start discussing what is already allowed on a school campus, what would already count as an affiliated school club. And as we have already discussed, this extremist ISIS club would not be protected by the school, would not be allowed to be affiliated with the school.
Also, I would also like to add that the specifics that they're saying would not pass the Brandenburg test multiple times that they're bringing up with ISIS calling to kill Americans. All of these are also much too broad to even pass the test that they are setting up because they're not specific enough to have passed the same test that they're saying that we should follow in the first place.
The affirmative team, did you want to respond?
Yeah, certainly I can respond to both parts of that. So the first thing is we think the fact that we only focused on a specific instance that hasn't yet happened is actually a good thing and something that the negative team would agree with, and that we don't want this super broad means of determining what clubs should be banned, because that would allow for tons of organizations to be banned just because of their own political ideologies. We agree that that is a bad thing. The very fact that we focus on this one niche area is evidence that this test is very strict and would not allow for the egregious banning of organizations just because an administrator from a university would want that to be the case.
How would you respond on the negative team?
I would like to reemphasize that, our Zane mentioned a really good point that, I'm really glad that none of these things are happening right now, which proves that we don't need to make any harsher restrictions than we already have. The negative is arguing for the status quo, which seems to be working fairly well. I don't know why we need to be insinuating that there are these crazy hypotheticals that may happen one day, so we need to enforce stricter rules.
Would you like to respond, Jake?
Yeah, I'd like to bring up that the negative even mentioned some examples in the status quo where basically the resolution is being affirmed. They mentioned that if universities believe there will legitimately be violence on their campus, they are justified in removing these clubs and events from campus. And so what we're saying is that there are legitimate reasons under these guidelines that universities could be legitimately worried that violence would come to their campus. We're not trying to argue that it's super common or that it's going to happen each and every day on college campuses. But what we're saying is that if you negate the resolution, you're saying that universities have absolutely no recourse to ban these violent extremist clubs from campus. And I would like to say as well that this club was attempted to be started on 2 actual college campuses in 2015. And the administrators were allowing this club to go through. So while they keep saying that this is like an extremist example that will never happen, well, in 2015, almost 2 clubs supporting ISIS were approved by their school's administration. We think that schools need recourse to address terror sympathy and violent extremism on their campus.
The affirmative team, the negative team indicated that the clubs cannot be responsible for candidates' speech. How would you respond to that?
I think there's a difference between being responsible for like one quote that your candidate said that doesn't specifically violate the Brandenburg test and providing financial support to an organization whose core ideology, mission, and pretty much everything they say is encouraging violent extremism against the United States. So we're not saying that just because a club in the past has, for example, supported an American political candidate that then came out and said something that we think is like counter to democratic values is an issue. What we're saying is if you continue to support an organization and political candidates that have gone on record to try and incite violence against the United States, that is a problem. And there needs to be recourse on college campuses to address that.
Negative team, how would you respond?
I actually want to thank Jake for bringing this back to the resolution. As he was saying that this resolution is discussing banning clubs when the candidate that they are supporting is using insightful speech. It's only unconstitutional when this insightful speech is proven to lead to imminent unlawful action. So what they're saying is, even though they're only picking a very, very minute point of that, it is still unconstitutional for, again, supporting versus promoting, for someone to simply support someone that already is in their not affiliated with unlawful action. I think that basically their argument would be limiting a lot of the speech that we are trying to protect.
The affirmative side, how would you respond?
Yeah, again, like in the instances that you brought up in your case, like the Young Republicans, or the instance that we bring up in our case with liberal campuses trying to ban Turning Point USA, we don't think that this banning of political campus or clubs on campus should be used in any way for ideological purposes or purposes to restrict speech that is protected by the Constitution. That is specifically why we're employing the Brandenburg test here and focusing only on examples that are directly inciting violence against Americans, because that is the standard we need to hold to. We agree that we want to protect constitutional free speech. We want to protect the First Amendment, but there's a difference between exercising your right to free speech and trying to foment violent extremism and terrorism against the United States. Your right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness ends when you start violating someone else's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you don't just get to go out into the world and scream fire in a crowded theater. You don't get to just go out and support political candidates that are calling for the death directly of Americans, saying that we will continue to strike the necks of your people with our knife.
How would you respond?
So as I've stated before, and I'd like to reiterate, Jake keeps bringing up examples of ISIS saying terrible, horrible things about killing Americans. However, none of these specific examples that he's using would pass the test that they are saying that we should use. None of these are specific enough examples. And if they had passed the test that we've both insinuated might be used, it had to have led to imminent lawless action, which if it was on campus would absolutely be okay for them to be banned under the status quo because that imminent lawless action was brought to campus. However, simply supporting someone for making inciting statements, there's a large gap that they're trying to bridge between actual violence being held on campus that universities can have control over and simply inciting speech in general.
Yeah, I think this is a great point. And one thing that I think we should make clear is that none of us are judges for a court that can determine whether or not something would pass. And then the second thing is a lot of these statements made by ISIS are happening abroad, which are outside the jurisdiction of the US to punish. So of course, these instances are not going to be challenged. If it happened, if an ISIS recruiter was in the US making those statements, of course, we think that they would be considered insightful speech. We think that this provides, we've also argued that we fulfilled both of the prongs of the Brandenburg test sufficiently based off of the rhetoric used abroad and what that would be like if it was used here.
And how would you respond for the last response to the affirmative or to the negative side?
I would like to just finish this off by saying that Zane continued to mention how this example was abroad and how this is already not protected by American jurisdiction. So if we can't expect what is happening with ISIS to be protected under American jurisdiction, how can we expect it to be protected under our university's jurisdiction?
This will conclude the second part, and we'll move into the closing arguments. And we'll start with the affirmative side for the closing arguments. Thank you.
Is everyone all
You
good?
have, yes.
Sorry.
I will raise my hand at 4 minutes, and you have a total of 5.
Right on. All right. Zane and I first want to reiterate that incitement requires acts of violence, requires this imminent violent action. The negative has repeatedly brought up examples of controversial candidates and then said, we are trying to ban these political clubs from campus. However, that is not true. All the affirmative is saying is that there are some legitimate reasons in our society to be banning these political clubs from campus. As judges, you should ask yourself at the end of this debate whether you can think of a single instance in which it would be appropriate for a college to ban a political club on campus in the context of the resolution. The negative team may agree that colleges should ban clubs that support ISIS, and I think they have done so in this debate, but they disagree on the reason behind the ban. They argue that they ought to be banned because they support political candidates that actively engage in terrorism, but not because they use inciting speech, because this inciting speech is abroad or would already be protected under university and constitutional protections. But if we can already remove these examples from our college campuses, isn't this a good thing? An example of when the affirmative world has helped address these issues. So let's look towards the few key issues in today's round. I think both of us, the affirmative and the negative, agree that banning clubs like the Young Republicans or Turning Point USA for ideological reasons is an extremely harmful act that denigrates the marketplace of ideas. But we provide you the example of the ISIS club, which the negative team has repeatedly said it didn't come into existence and therefore it is not a legitimate argument. However, look back to the fact that in 2015, 2 universities quite literally almost made this a club on their campus. And second, look to the wording of the resolution that simply asks if there are any legitimate reasons why you would ban a campus club that supports a political candidate using inciting speech. Through this thought experiment, if we can prove to you even one instance where supporting a political candidate like a candidate from ISIS that uses inciting speech should be banned from campus, you should affirm. But second, let's turn to the limited nature of the Brandenburg test. The negative team has specifically mentioned that our own examples don't satisfy the Brandenburg test, but then also go on to say that they're worried that if we use the Brandenburg test, political candidates will be banned unfairly. First off, I don't think that both of those two things can be true. And second, I think that the ISIS example clearly matches the Brandenburg test, that first asks you if speech is directed to incite or produce imminent lawless action, and second, if that speech is likely to incite or produce such action. Well, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's words that he is going to continue to stab his knife at the neck of Americans is clearly intended to create lawless action in the United States. And then the imminent attacks that followed in Orlando, in San Bernardino, at Ohio State University, are clear-cut examples of when that inciting speech became a problem in our society. But finally, let's turn towards a key argument that the negative made. And I really, really, really appreciate that they brought up the Equal Access Act and that we need to be protecting the freedom, viability, and academic integrity of our clubs on campus. But they mention that the Equal Access Act protects people for political, philosophical disagreements, but also the orderly conduct of schools. Even under the standards established by the negative team, we believe we have proven to you today that a club in the model of an ISIS club would be protecting or would be fomenting disorderly conduct at schools, disorderly conduct in American society. At the end of the day, we think that most examples of banning clubs for purely political reasons is a bad thing. However, we do believe that in hyper-specific instances where violence is going to happen, is incited by this political club and the candidates they support, you need to allow universities to have recourse in banning these clubs from campus to protect themselves from violent extremism and terrorism and keep our educational environments open, safe, and free for all of us to use. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to the negative side for a great debate.
This I'd like to begin, please.
All right. Nyah and I want to thank our opponents for an amazing debate, as well as our judges for joining us today to discuss such important matters. If we could just take a second to consider how fortunate we all are to be lending our voices in this ever-going fight in protecting free speech, it's truly amazing. That being said, Nyah and I want to stress the importance of maintaining free speech on campus, as inciting speech is only constitutionally unprotected when advocating for imminent unlawful action. Simply supporting said candidates is protected by the First Amendment. We question the legitimacy of the AF's argument, claiming that universities should have the power to limit speech universally recognized as free. This places unwarranted bias on such politically affiliated groups, equating their support to somehow advocating for imminent action. We want to emphasize that there is a clear difference between what a political candidate says and what a school club stands for. It would be incredibly unconstitutional for administrators to regulate what candidate the Young Democrats, for instance, could support. My opponents heavily rely on one example that has not come to fruition already and would be stopped by the status quo. This is not only dangerous and heavily biased, but also diminishes First Amendment rights on campus. We have discussed the disparities between support and promote, something our opponents failed to acknowledge. Using ISIS as political candidates when they themselves defined a candidate as someone who was running for office, as ISIS is outside of this provided definition, their main point is null and void. They continue to mention how this did not come to pass, but we should have legislation to protect our students. We already have that in our status quo. Their singular example related to the administration solely defining these matters, which is already not how the system is set up. They continued implementing such vocabulary such as "I think," already making their argument more subjective in its use of hypotheticals. It is also dubious to call ISIS candidates. Although we have already stated numerous times to attempt to mold away from this ISIS argument, as we have proved that it does not fall under this resolution, our opponents continuously failed to provide any other examples or path, meaning that this is the only argument that they had prepared. We are currently living in the world of this resolution. If anything, this proves that the AF is fighting for an extremist point of view that has been proven to be a non-issue. As Nyah discussed, universities act as limited public forums, meaning that campuses have the right to limit speech not protected under the First Amendment and enforce time, place, and manner restrictions. However, these forums cannot restrict who attends, speaks, or is affiliated with the clubs based on viewpoint discrimination unless these individuals directly incite violent disturbances. As we stated, schools are allowed to prohibit vulgar, lewd, and obscene speech, speech that intrudes upon the rights of other students, and a safe harbor provision that protects schools from extremists. We would like to refocus the definition of inciting speech, that inciting equals advocating for illegal activity, but unless there is cause for imminent action, it isn't always unconstitutional. On the manner of speech not protected by the First Amendment, it is already the university's right to ban any club, whether political or not, if they are deliberately bringing imminent lawless action to campus. However, if no promotion or actual imminent action is gathered, it is unconstitutional for a student to permanently remove these clubs, making the AF's argument null and void. On the basis of non-university campuses, the government explicitly protects political groups with the Equal Access Act, stating that if discrimination occurs against these clubs, government funding could no longer be received. Our last note is to stress how broad support means. Simply saying, vote blue no matter who, could not permanently ban an entire club. We understand that whenever we are discussing matters of such nature, it is incredibly difficult to choose one singular side, especially when listening to one singular hour debate. If you're still questioning each argument and can only take one more thing out of this case, I want us all to understand that we are discussing political viewpoint discrimination. This is discrimination that is incredibly dangerous, especially in our current political environment, where around 50% of our students are scared to speak out on who they support as a candidate in general, yet alone joining a broad club such as something like the Young Republicans or Democrats, to only be met by fear of expulsion. We ask the judges to join us in protecting the First Amendment rights of students everywhere by voting with the negative for the resolution. There are legitimate reasons to ban political clubs on campus if they support political candidates that use inciting speech. Thank you.
Thank you for all the debaters for a wonderful debate and the judges for listening. Thank you very much. And this concludes round one.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.